When you think of Oklahoma, one of the last things you probably think about is the Chinese mob. Though I shouldn't assume, maybe you do. But if you do, this story is not going to be that surprising to you. Because as it turns out, Oklahoma has actually become the epicenter of America's booming illegal marijuana market. And organized crime groups with ties to the Chinese government are behind it. Or at least, that's what's been revealed by a joint investigation from ProPublica and the Frontier. Now with that said, it's not like organized crime or the illicit drug trade is new to the United States. But what is interesting here is how it's actually being driven in some ways by the increasing but uneven legalization of marijuana across the country. So let's start there. Marijuana is now legal in one form or another in about 40 states. But that also means you can encounter very different rules about how the stuff can be grown, sold, and consumed just by crossing state lines. And the investigation found that this legal variability is part of what's created the conditions for a massive black market to thrive. Which brings us to Oklahoma. See, even in states where weed is legal, laws typically limit how much someone is allowed to actually grow. In Colorado, for example, a marijuana cultivation facility can be licensed in different classes or tiers depending on the number of plants being grown or whether it's for medicinal use or retail. But when Oklahomans voted to legalize medical marijuana back in 2018, they approved a measure that didn't place any limits on the number of dispensaries or growing operations. Like it literally said, there shall be no limits on how much marijuana a licensed grower can grow. And so this, along with cheap land and limited enforcement of other rules, helped turn Oklahoma into a top destination for black market marijuana growers almost overnight. And one man at the forefront of all this goes by the name Chiang Chen, where he came to the US from China around 30 years ago. For a long time, he stayed pretty much off the radar, with his only documented encounters with the law being some tickets for speeding and reckless driving. And whether or not Chen was actually a law-abiding citizen all those years, he definitely wasn't in 2017. Because that's when he and his brother purchased a property in California and converted the barn into an illegal grow house, trying to take advantage of the state's recent legalization of marijuana. And as the article explains, they were far from the only ones trying to do something like this, saying the cross-country move was part of a migration of criminal groups into the marijuana industry. Other destinations included Colorado and the Pacific Northwest. And going on to say the players who established clandestine grows included Mexican cartels, Cuban immigrant gangs, and longtime locals. But the Chinese crews were the biggest and best organized. And it's not like this went totally unnoticed. Chen, his brother, and several of their associates were busted in 2018 as part of a joint operation between states and the federal government called Operation Lights Out. But other than that, there apparently haven't been that many big operations targeting the Chinese-run marijuana trade. Now, part of the struggle is just that state and federal agencies lack the people who know Chinese language and culture well enough to investigate the cases. But also, former DEA officials told ProPublica and the Frontier that they've also just become less of a priority. And they say that's actually a mistake because the illegal marijuana industry isn't just about marijuana. It's also a way for criminal organizations to fund their other operations like money laundering and migrant smuggling. Ray Donovan, the former chief of operations for the DEA, telling the investigation team, the challenge we're having is a lack of interest by federal prosecutors to charge illicit marijuana cases. And adding, they don't realize all the implications. Marijuana causes so much crime at the local level, gun violence in particular. The same group selling thousands of pounds of marijuana are also laundering millions of dollars of fentanyl money. And that leads us back to Oklahoma. See, after the medical marijuana measure passed there, it basically became the new California, at least for growing weed. Except it was actually even better, because without any legal limits on quantities, growers could just grow tens of thousands of plants on a cheap bit of farmland, all while disguising it as a legal operation. And that's what Chiang Chen did. And he did this with an associate by the name of Yifei Lin. See, after receiving a probation sentence for his 2018 bust, Chen allegedly had Lin purchase a 10-acre property in Kingfisher County for $280,000. And then he paid cash to a local man by the name of Richard Ignacio to pose as the 75% owner of the business and obtain a license, circumventing a state law that marijuana businesses be majority owned by Oklahoma residents. And once again, they were far from the only ones, with a DEA agent from Denver by the name of Ray Padilla estimating that 90% of the illegal marijuana growers that had been in Colorado moved to Oklahoma. With that many new people coming in, Oklahoma quickly became a top producer of black market weed. And at this point, I feel like I need to throw some numbers at you so you kind of understand what I mean, just to try to convey the scale of this thing. Where we had officials estimating that the value of the state's illegal marijuana market is somewhere between $18 billion and $44 billion a year. That makes it the second biggest industry in the state, only trailing the oil and gas industry. And at its peak, authorities suspected that most of the 10,000 licensed marijuana growers in the state were actually trafficking on the black market. And 80% of the links that they found between illegal growers and foreign crime groups were with groups of Chinese origin. And like the DEA guy said, it is not just about the weed. In 2023, for example, authorities uncovered a human trafficking operation linked to a brothel inside a northwest Oklahoma City home, with Mark Woodward, a spokesperson for the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics, saying the clients coming and going from this brothel were administrators and managers of marijuana farms, specifically linking the rise of marijuana farms to increased prostitution as well as the use of drugs like ketamine. And on top of that, court cases and testimonies reveal things like illegal casinos cropping up and a general rise in robberies and violence. But the crime that made international headlines and in the investigation's words set off a flurry of investigative activity and political attention, that took place on Chiang Chen's farm in 2022, a few months after a man by the name of Chen Wu moved to Oklahoma and invested in the operation. See, Wu had worked on the farm for a short time before arguing with his associates over money. But in November, he came back, barging into the garage, shooting Chen in the knee, and demanding that the others get the money that he believed that he was owed. And we're talking $300,000 worth. And by the end of the night, 4 people were dead, with Wu speeding toward Florida while on the phone with smugglers to get help fleeing the country. But the police arrested Wu before he could escape, and a judge later sentencing him to life without the possibility of parole. And so with all eyes on Oklahoma, the officials initiated a crackdown. And notably, a crackdown that they say has nearly halved the number of growing operations in the state. But that also wasn't the end of it, with a bipartisan group of state and federal lawmakers sending a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland in February expressing concerns that, quote, Chinese nationals are reportedly operating thousands of illicit marijuana farms across the country, and calling out farms in Oklahoma as well as in Maine and Washington state. And with that, also raising the issue of the Chinese Communist Party's involvement in the industry. Right, and this is one of the key issues that we haven't touched on yet. Basically, it's believed that in exchange for government protection, Chinese gangs provide the CCP with illicit financial services as well as spying on and intimidating Chinese immigrant communities. So on top of these concerns about crime and violence, we have this argument that this is actually a national security issue as well. You know, all of this isn't to say that marijuana itself or the legalization of this stuff is inherently a bad thing. I mean, we've seen how much real harm's been caused by the criminalization of pot and the war on drugs. And the goal here isn't to vilify Chinese or other immigrant communities. I mean, in fact, the victims of these gangs are more often than not Chinese immigrants themselves, with the investigation noting they're the ones working under abusive conditions at these farms and being forced into prostitution for the bosses. But the whole thing is certainly a lesson in unintended consequences, as we have this crazy contrast where the legalization of marijuana has in some ways led to this massive expansion of the underground market.